Please welcome John Seel.
It's a great joy to be with you. My name is John, and I'm a broken sinner saved by grace. The book that I have written, which you have agreed to pray that it will launch, it launches on Monday. I have not seen a copy of it. So I'm hopeful that when I go home tonight, I will actually be able to pick up the first copy of the book. But there's actually no place I'd rather be to launch this book than to be with my brothers here in Darien in the New Canaan meeting. This is a book that makes two very audacious claims. Claims for which I'm sure to be criticized. One is I claim that almost everything said about millennials is wrong. Now there's probably no generational cohort that has been studied more and by really smart people for longer than millennials. Anybody who is working in business has been to seminars and trying to figure out how your business can adapt to millennials, can reach millennials, and companies that blow them off, like Applebee did recently. My guess is that CEO will be gone within a year. So it's a little audacious to say that a lot of the stereotypes we have about millennials are wrong, but that's one of the claims of the book. The other claim of the book is that the American Evangelical Church will not survive unless it listens to the unchurched. Now that's a really big popular message to tell a pastor, that your survival is dependent on your listening to people who are unaffiliated with your church, don't like your church, and want nothing to do with your church, and your survival is dependent on listening to them and coming to some understanding of what they're saying, which is a little bit like saying the survival of the New York Yankees is dependent on listening to the Boston Red Sox, or more recently, the survival of the New York Jets is dependent on listening to the Patriots. Now that's, huh? That's right. Well, I'm a Boston person, so I do know where I am. I have a T-shirt that says I live in Philadelphia, but all my teams are in New England. And our season is just starting. In Boston, this preseason is the regular season, and the real season starts now. And I was really rooting for the Titans, which I thought was the weaker of the teams. So this is a little bit of a controversial thesis, I recognize. I think that basically what we have done is use a 2D lens to describe a 3D reality. And if you've ever gone to a 3D movie and not put on the glasses, you see something, but it's all distorted. And millennials actually think very differently, and I'm going to argue they actually think better, but that almost all the research done on them is looking at them through a 2D lens. Usually it's 55-year-old boomer sociologists who are asking them questions that they would never ask themselves, and then analyzing that data in a frame that is completely alien to the experience of the way they view life and reality. So you can say something, but it's not at all how they would view it or say it. Now, one of the clues to this is that millennials are very defensive about actually being called millennials. It has become a four-letter word, and if somebody that looks like me and is of my age talks to them and says, I do studies on millennials, immediately their defenses will go up because they have been misunderstood and put down for so long, and they're the butt of every corporate joke there is, and entertainment has laughed at them, and they're frequently laughed at on Fox, etc. Now, if you're telling a story about a generational cohort, and they don't see themselves in the story you're telling about them, or worse, they're really pissed off by the story you're telling about them, then maybe, just maybe, you're telling the wrong story. And I didn't actually come to this insight by myself. I asked a researcher out in Portland, Oregon, to do a $100,000 survey for me on what our sociologists call religious nuns, people who are religiously unaffiliated. Fastest growing group of religious change in America is this group of people who are religiously unaffiliated, of which millennials represent about 40% of that group. And of that 40%, about 80% grew up in the church. Or put it this way, the church as it is presently configured today is creating the fastest growth of young people who are disassociated with the church. We're the engines of this disenchantment with organized religion. And so I asked him if he would do this survey. This guy's name literally was Charlie Brown of Context Partners. And he said, I can't do it because they're asking all the wrong questions. He says, if you really want to do a survey, you got to ask the millennials what questions they would want you to ask. You've got to do what this is academic speak, but he said you need to do a collaborative ethnography, which I said, that sounds expensive. What is that, an expensive focus group? He said, no, it's a research method where you actually let the participant tell you what are the questions to ask, and that's actually the step that's missing and why we're getting so much of this wrong. Now, I happen to be a champion of millennials and very hopeful for the church. I do believe that the church, I think the metaphor I use in the book is of the Titanic. Very confident, steaming at flank speed. Here's some rumors that there's some problems on the horizon, takes a 3-degree course change further to the south, and puts a person on the bow. That's all he did, and stayed at flank speed. And the Marconi operators who were handling ship-to-shore communication from the passengers actually had much more current information that they were in real grave danger of icebergs. And millennials in your church actually are those people, but those Marconi operators never relayed any of that information to the captain. And they steamed right into the iceberg. And the good captain, Edwards, went down with the ship. Now, I think that is a metaphor for what the church is facing. Some of you are sailors, and you know on the maritime radio, channel 16, they have Serete, Serete, Pon Pon, and Mayday, Mayday. Pon Pon is a warning that is given that is serious, but not a crisis, but please pay attention. So they'll give a Pon Pon warning in Boston Harbor if a cruise ship is going out, or if a tanker is coming in with hazardous fuel, or a military ship is coming out where you have to stay away from military ships. They'll give a Pon Pon warning. So my book is a Pon Pon warning to the church. It's not Mayday, meaning there is time for us to respond. I'm not at all confident that senior leadership of people my age will actually respond to this message that Leadership of the church, if they're going to survive, need to listen with great care to the unchurched. That's a pretty big gap. Now, we can talk in theory about the history of the church, etc., but I want to talk a little more personally about the realities of millennials in our own lives. Most of you are roughly my age, and many of you have millennial children. And there is a large story within the Evangelical church that's not told of what's happened to the next generation of kids, where they've abandoned their faith of their fathers. They have taken up completely alternative lifestyles. They have political views that we can't quite understand. And things like Thanksgiving and Christmas are either heavily bracketed or highly uncomfortable because there is a fundamental gap in perspective. And at one level, it's true, we've always had a generation gap, yet intuitively we have this sense that something is actually deeper here, because it's not just the fact that they're addicted to cell phones and they have a different way of processing life and reality, and that they do text us instead of call us. And we think that's a little weird, and they think it's perfectly appropriate. But the fact is that there are a lot of books written about prospective parenting. You have young children, and so you write a book on how you can be a good parent and have all the hope that they will follow in the footsteps of Christ and the Lord and end up being godly leaders in NCS. There are no books on books for parents after the fact. And there's no talk in the church. There's this silence. No one's saying, by the way, my son has just invited me to his gay wedding. And what do I do? My son just announced that he's transgender and is wanting some money to help fund his medical transition. My kids are really into some very bizarre religious kinds of things, and will not tolerate anything that I have to say about Christ or the church. What do I do? There's almost no conversation for those of us who are dealing with kids like that, who, if they were to see on our television screen that we're watching Sean Hannity, would have a conniption fit. So I want to talk a little bit about our kids, and gives just 3 suggestions on where we might start in that conversation. Now, this book, its principal audience is boomer pastors. Its secondary audience is millennial pastors who feel like they don't have a voice. And the third audience are parents who have no idea how to understand their kids. And then if they did understand their kids, how to help them along on their spiritual journey right where they are. So if you're in one of those categories, this book has things to say to you. And I would say that the research in this book has been validated by the hardcore people who really do not like the church and are really serious new Copernicans or millennials. My son Alex, who was the long-haired guy with the parrot on his shoulder, who is an artist and very active in Black Lives Matter and Artists for Justice in Brooklyn. He teaches art at Rikers Prison. And he just married a DACA dreamer from Colombia, whose father worked for the Medellin cartel, was killed by the cartel. She grew up playing in Pablo Escobar's house. Anyway, that's my daughter-in-law, who's lovely, but I've become really quite a DACA. DACA now has a face. It's not just a public policy issue in my family, so I pay a lot of attention to that. Tom Scott, who lives down the road, works for Nantucket Project. He wanted me to talk on this to his staff. He said, John, look at you. How do you have any credibility talking on millennials? Just look at you. Now, Dan said, I've never seen John look so casual. Some of you know that I always wear a suit and tie, and this is the impact of studying millennials. My wife said, don't you think you should take a suit and tie? I said, no, I'm in my author mode now. So Tom Scott said, you better bring your son along because you have no credibility talking to this crowd. And I agreed. And Alex said to me, Dad, if you're going to have any credibility on this book, you need to come talk to my friends, all of whom are the leadership of Black Lives Matter in Manhattan, Brooklyn, actually Bushwick, so you know where I'm talking about. So I went down to Chelsea, and I went to an art gallery filled with kind of Jackson Pollock, very modern, and that's where we had our meeting. And I basically said to them, please, save me from myself. Be my crap detectors. I'm going to talk. I feel bad about talking about your generation because one thing I know is I'm not one of them. But I want to know if I've gotten this in any way right. So, and I gave my talk. Black, white, documented, undocumented, they were all there. At the end of this presentation, we took some questions, and at the end of that, they said, John, could we meet every month? And so for every month for 2 years now, I have been meeting with this group of millennial young people for whom I'm like, I don't know what I have to tell you. I'm just here to listen. And usually I just say one thing and then they're off arguing and I listen and take notes. But I do know that what started as a hunch has now been pretty much validated by people in the trenches who actually live and experience this reality day to day. So where to start with our kids? 3 things. First, I think we have to begin our engagement with an apology. I'm sorry that we have not taken you as seriously as you deserve to be taken. I mean, I'm of the opinion that not only do they think differently, but they think better, and that if we would think more like them, we would actually end up being more like Jesus. But that's not what normally is said about them. They're the butt of every joke. They're very defensive about it themselves. And if they are the solution, we have found ways to totally discount their credibility. And one of the gifts we can give them is simply saying, you have something really important to say. I need to learn it. I don't know what it is. But I need to learn to listen to you. And so we have to start with a level of an apology. The second thing is that new Copernicans, who are I call spiritually oriented millennials are roughly, first of all, I'm not really heavily into the cohort research. So people will say, well, what are the age groups of millennials? I'm going to tell you 1980 to 2000, so roughly upper 30s to 20s, young adults is roughly what we're talking about. But then I'm not one to make a lot of distinction between Gen Y, Gen Z, Gen X. I mean, you start parsing it. And that's what the media types do, and that's the kind of research which I find where some of these distortions start emerging in spades. And so I try to stay away from that. But they give you some idea. So New Copernicans for me is people who are spiritually oriented millennials who process life and reality and relationships with a completely different way, a completely different frame, in that sense, a new Copernican frame. Just like Copernicus saw the world as heliocentric rather than geocentric, their framework is radically that different. So the thing that they do not like is processing reality in both and black and white kind of categories. They like 50 Shades of Gray. So they are much more oriented to a both and way of framing life and reality rather than black and white. In that sense, they would be much more Trinitarian, to use Christian language, in their orientation, because the Trinity is a category that kind of, we can't quite get all of our intellectual categories around, and that's actually intentional. And we're actually going to say that the root of all reality is Trinitarian, and so they're willing to embrace that level of complexity and at the same time recognize that there's more to knowing than we know, and that reality is larger than I can possibly know. God is bigger than all the categories of theologians have put him into, and that I could be wrong. Even on things for which I have a lot of conviction, I need to actually start the conversation by recognizing that I could be wrong. And that's why I need to listen to you, because truth is larger than my own subjective perception of truth. Now, that means we have to hold our deepest convictions with an open hand rather than a closed fist. Now, some people are going to say, isn't that embracing relativism? Isn't that kind of a come-see, come-saw? No, it's just change in your attitude and tonality about the way you articulate your convictions. And that change in attitude that is steeped in humility is essential to have any kind of meaningful conversation with our New Copernican children, our millennial children. The problem is that under pressure, most of the time in the church, under pressure, what we tend to do is double down. We become more convinced, more agitated, more close-fisted, and I feel very, very sorry for children of evangelicals who are trapped and feel like they have no place to go, and what we're doing is actually making them atheists. And in large numbers. 80% of kids who are in our youth groups, after 2 years in college, will have abandoned their faith. Now, if you're in business and you have an 80% failure rate, it would suggest that maybe we should rethink this whole project. And that's part of the purpose of this book, is to rethink this entire project. But not only do we need to start with an apology because we recognize they have something valuable to add, even though we're not quite sure what it is, and they might not be quite sure what it is. And secondly, we have to articulate our faith in a way that is communicated with an open hand. So I don't start the conversation as if I have all the answers. This is where I am on my journey. I'm pretty sure that Jesus did rise from the dead. I'm pretty sure about his saving work on the cross. But I do recognize that there's more to both the incarnation and the atonement than I can get my hands around. And that means we have to have a completely changed attitude. And fathers, we are often the problem. Because we have a tendency to think we have it all figured out. Now, it's less the case in AA, and it's less the case in the Christian AA, known as NCS, because we come with a level of authenticity and humility, and it's what makes this a unique and special place, different from so many of our other church environments where the kind of normal conversation that happens here would be viewed as very bizarre and not safe. So, do I think that New Copernicans have a natural affinity for the kind of conversation that takes place here at NCS? Absolutely. And that you've largely been preconditioned to actually accept this. With one caveat. We can be really good about how we articulate ourselves in this group, but when we go home, our wives and our children have ways of pushing buttons that we didn't even know existed. And so it becomes much more difficult. And if it gets off on, will you come to my gay wedding? That might be a little hard to articulate down at the Darien Country Club. And so shame and other factors come in, and we don't know how to navigate some of those kinds of things. The last thing I want to say in the remaining minutes I have is that we need to change our attitude of evangelism. Our attitude of evangelism is, I have a little pedestal, I stand up and I preach, I have the knowledge, I'm communicating it to you, and we need to get off that little soapbox, and what we need to do is think of it as we're walking together with fellow travelers on the Appalachian Trail. And along the way on the trail, we will run into other hikers who are walking at a little faster pace or a little slower pace. We'll catch up to them, we'll have brief encounters and conversations. And what we need to be able to do is in those brief encounters, ask a poignant question that helps them on their journey. So we need to see ourselves as fellow journeyers, pilgrims on a common spiritual journey. Now, I'm pretty articulate on this I'm pretty firm on this point. You cannot thrive in life unless you have a spiritual journey. I'm not telling you where to go. I'm not telling you how to go, how fast to go, but I will tell you this. If you do not have a serious spiritual journey as a part of your life, you will not thrive as a person. And by and large, most people, particularly young people, will resonate with that. And the journeys, because millennials tend to be very aspirational, that is, they're looking to make the world a better place, they tend to look in the area of social justice, in the area of beauty, in the area of relationships, or in the area of spirituality. And what is best is for you to find with your children what is the area that they are resonating with. What are the on-ramps that you can connect with them on in a way that will be meaningful for you to actually invest in and learn about, and then help them see their journey in this area where they have particular passions. Obviously, my son Alex is passionate about social justice, and so I have become, with him, a conversation partner about our penal system and about our immigration system and about all the other issues that are on his radar, because that's his on-ramp. And it will be different for all of our children, but the third thing I would say is that we need to be fellow pilgrims that are looking for on-ramps for spiritual progress. And all we can do then is to help them move one step further. Our children's lives are not a photograph, it's a movie. And so we need to be patient over time. But if we would change our attitudes, start with an apology, recognize that they have something incredibly valuable that we need, and then help them on their journey, we will find great possibilities with them. Now, my book outlines the three ways we can, they're basically three paths that people can take, and we will, and it unpacks the 6 characterizations of New Copernicans, which are different from what you've read in lots of the marketing literature. But I think it will be helpful to you as parents. But most importantly, as fathers, we need to change our frame, our attitude, and how we communicate the truths of the gospel to them in ways that are relevant to their lives. Thank you very much.